Test 1, 2, 1, 2. Awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. It is so good to be with you all this morning. Another beautiful Sabbath day where we can come together, worship together. We are wrapping up our series today on the book of Ephesians. So exciting. Also, a little tear because this book is so awesome. But good news, you can spend as much time as you want in this book on your own. So that is so awesome. We just a little bit of recap here as we go into the last section of Ephesians. Paul established the church of Ephesians in about AD 53 on his way to Jerusalem. He later actually stayed there for 3 years. Later, he appointed Timothy as the pastor of this church. He loved the people of Ephesians, the people of Ephesus, and so he wrote the book of Ephesians. And this particular book is so inspiring and so encouraging because it wasn't written to actually fix a problem that the church was having. It was just written to be a general letter of encouragement. And actually, originally, it didn't even have the name Ephesus in it. It was just written very generically as a letter that could be circulated around all the churches of that time. We looked at the first 3 chapters of this book, the promise that God gives his people. And so cool how all of these promises that he gives are written in the indicative tense, like that has already happened. They're already done. They're already fulfilled. It says, he has seated you in heavenly places. How cool is that? That we've been seated with Christ, that our salvation is assured to us. Just so beautiful. And because of this, he leads into the next section in chapters 4 and 5. Remember, this is one full letter, not just individual chapters that we can just take apart, but just totally, encompass, like if someone were to write you a letter, you don't just chop sections out. It's just one fluid thought. So in this next piece, it's the calling that God gives us because of this promise. So because he showered us in his kindness, because he's lavished his grace on us, because his mercies are new every morning, because he's raised us with Christ from the dead and seated us in heavenly places, because of all of this, there's an order to the gospel. He now calls us to this new way of living. And we looked at this last week, so check that video out if you haven't had a chance to yet, or go back and watch it later just for a refresher. But he calls us to unity in our marriages. He calls us to unity in our churches. He calls us to expand and grow in our maturity and our knowledge of who God is. There's so many beautiful facets of this calling that he gives us, but we cannot motivate ourselves to do this. It comes only from the promise that he laid out in the first 3 chapters. And by fixing our eyes on those things, we can find the motivation, the encouragement, the inspiration that we need to live the life that he has called us to live. Well, today we are looking at the battle from Ephesians chapter 6. Now, Ephesians chapter 6 starts out with some kind of as an extension, an extension, if you will, of chapter 5. And I don't know, I probably would have moved chapter 6 back a little bit if I had been laying out the numbers. But this battle section really begins kind of in verse 10. So that's where we're going to pick up. And just think of the first 9 verses there as kind of an extension of chapter 5 that we were looking at. So let's just pick this up. We're talking about the reality of spiritual warfare in the world around us. Now, this is really huge, and I love how Paul enters into this section. He says, finally. Okay, so now we understand, right? Because we went through 2 weeks on Ephesians 1 through 3, and then Ephesians 4 through 5, and we understand all of these things that Paul has said. The promise that God has given us, our response to that promise and the calling of our lives. And now he gets to this point, and you can see why he says, finally. Now, here's the last thing I'm going to give you right here. This is the last part. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. I love that he doesn't say, okay, now here's what I want you to get. You really got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You better be working out because you're going to need a lot of your own strength and your own power to fight this enemy that we're going to be. Not at all. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Remember when God was questioning Job, because Job had been questioning God, and so later in the book of Job, I think it's chapter 38 and on, and God says, he says, okay, now I'm going to question you, and you're going to answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When I did all these, when I separated and divided the waters from the land, when I hung the stars in the sky and the galaxies, which we can look at with telescopes and stuff now and know that the universe is infinitely expanding. Like we're just a speck on a grain of sand of the seashore of this universe. We see God's power. We can take assurance and hope and excitement and peace and security, and that this power that we're going to talk about does not have to come from you or from me. It comes from God. God's strength, not ours. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. So we're going to break this down little bit by little bit. Put on. This is an active process. It's not just going to happen. It's not going to happen with you not thinking about it, you not worrying about it, just going through your day. You have to do this. It's God's strength that you're going to be taking hold of. But indeed, you have to take hold of it. So what does that look like for you in your life? Put on the full armor of God. Now, why doesn't he just say the armor of God? Why does he say the full armor of God? Imagine a soldier. And we're gonna look at some pictures and some different things with this. So bear with me here until we get there. But imagine a soldier is supposed to have a helmet, a breastplate, a shield, a sword, a belt, the shoes. Now, what if he just goes into battle with no helmet, or with no shoes, or with no sword, or with no shield, or with no breastplate? If we're missing any piece of this armor, the enemy is going to be able to take us down. He's going to find our weakness because, make no mistake, he is scheming against you. He's in this process. This is like a mental process of creating an attack plan, custom built, custom tailored for you. God is serious about this. He's trying to warn us. He's telling us your enemy, the devil, Satan, Lucifer, the one who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking who he may devour, is scheming against you. So if we don't take this seriously, I'm not trying to over-amplify the devil's power because God could just squash him in a second. He has to get all of his authority from God. Like in the story of Job, God was the one that allowed him to do those things against you. But understand that he is scheming against you. So we got to take that very seriously. He wants to bring you down. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. This sounds like the latest Marvel movie, like just so intense and like epic, and just the spiritual forces of evil, like just, whoa, it sounds so intense. And so even though God, like he lays it out this way because he wants us to take this seriously. He wants us to understand our battle. We quarrel with people, whether in the church or out of the church, and we got these little quarrels and these little issues, and we get upset and we get angry, and we're like, well, the Lord really had to give me peace today because